What is going on, everyone? And welcome to WreckTalk. It's time to set aside NCAA 25, the video game. It's time to set aside me just absolutely trashing Jeff Collins because we're a month out from kickoff with Florida State. It's time to talk about football. So we've got about 4 weeks to kick off. I'd like to get all the predictions done. I've got 9 position groups, 3 weeks. We're going to do 3 a week heading out here. And then we'll do a season prediction video probably the Monday before we kick or the Friday before we kick. But I wanted to start it off on a high note. Let's talk about Georgia Tech's offensive line room. Now, a lot of people that aren't Tech fans, probably everyone that's not a Georgia Tech fan, is going to think that I'm out of my mind. Speaking of the NCAA 25 video game, they absolutely disrespected this group. I don't think there's anyone that's higher rated than like a 73 on our offensive line in this game, which is criminal. This might be, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a Tech fan, I'm saying this because I've watched this group. This might be the most underrated position group in all of college football. Georgia Tech has a fantastic offensive line room. There's a lot of experience in this room. There's a lot of good depth pieces in this room. So I do this every year. This will be the second year. So we're going to go back and look at last year's rating. So last year, I predicted them to be a B minus, which for many people, and even after I released that video, might have felt somewhat ambitious. Georgia Tech, the year before that, 2022, Key's interim year, struggled. Our whole offense struggled. Though last year, Key proved he's an offensive line guy, brings in what has turned out to be a very good position coach at the offensive line from App State. I would give them an A minus based on their production and their performance last year. Now, again, a lot of people that aren't Tech fans are probably going to say I'm out of my mind. Well, let's look at statistically how they perform. Number one rush offense in the conference, in the ACC. People might say, well, we don't think much of the ACC. They were 13th ranked nationally. That's a pretty damn good offensive line room. And it's not like we have a ton of five-star running backs that are just making ridiculous plays despite the offensive line. This was 100% driven by the offensive line. So 13th ranked nationally, number one in the conference. Now, pass offense, not so good. 7th in the conference, 68th nationally. But we'll come back to that. That's not on the offensive line. That's on turnovers by the quarterback position, the wide receiver position, however they want to look at it. I don't think that's on the offensive line. Now, number 3 in penalties committed in the conference. That's total offensive and defensive penalties, though I will say most of your penalties are going to come from the offensive and defensive line. But here's the big thing. Number 1 in sacks allowed in the conference and 15th nationally. There's only 14 teams in the country that gave up less sacks than Georgia Tech, and there's not a single team in the conference that gave up less sacks than Georgia Tech. That is the tell of a really good offensive line and just how good the job that Brent Key has done with this offensive line. Also, freshman All-American in Ethan McKinney. We have an injury at left tackle. Ethan McKinney steps up, absolutely balls out, earns himself for both On3 and ESPN freshman All-American honors. So I think grading them an A minus. If anything, you could probably make an argument to grade them an A instead of an A minus. Being conservative, and based on these stats, I don't think you could rate them anything less than an A minus. Now, let's look at our starting lineup. Obviously, we just talked about him, left tackle. Ethan McKinney's going to start as a sophomore at that left tackle job. The guy was an absolute beast at left tackle. That's your blind side tackle. So if you want to be really talented at one of your tackles, you want it to be your left tackle. Joe Fusil, a guy that earned a scholarship after being a walk-on player, a kid that's absolutely balled out. He'll come in as a redshirt junior this year. Very, very solid piece to have at that left guard. And All ACC honorable mention at center, Weston Franklin. He's a senior, and if you're going to have experience anywhere on your offensive line, you want it to be at the center position. He's the quarterback of your offensive line. He is what your quarterback is to your offense as it pertains to offensive line. Same with how your middle linebacker or Mike linebacker is the quarterback of your defense. Weston Franklin is great. And again, these are all players that gave up, I think it was 13 or 14 sacks all season, which was good enough for number one in the conference and 15th nationally. Now, I don't have key losses here. We really only have one, which is Scaglione. He was a senior. He came in for a year, transfer out of Princeton, and left. But we replace him with a really, really good piece. Keelan Rutledge, will be a junior this year, first team conference, all conference USA. Now he was in a car wreck, to my knowledge. He should be ready to go week 1. Even if he's not 100%, we do have some really good depth players we can put behind him. And the other senior on this offensive line, Jordan Williams at right tackle, another very good player. So the only place that we have an underclassman on our offensive line is at left tackle, which might make you say, oh, that makes me nervous. That's our blindside tackle. But he's a freshman All-American. Again, I think this is the most underrated position group for any team in college football. And I think there's a lot of things you can point to support that. Now we do lose some people in the portal. I've got all of our portal players here. We lose Gabe Fortson. I believe he was a freshman last year. He goes to Tulane. We also lose Jakiah Leftwich to North Carolina. I guess he liked how much he lost with Jeff Collins here. He decides to follow him over there to North Carolina, though I don't have any ill will towards any of these kids that transfer. Just curious to me that you'd go to North Carolina. By the way, I looked up, who was the worst in sacks allowed, who gave up the most. Colorado was next to dead last at 132. So there's only one team in the country that gave up more sacks than Colorado, though somehow they're supposed to be these world beaters this year. Jury will be out on. The jury's already ruled on that. It ain't going to happen. But this is a Georgia Tech video. Worst in the ACC was Virginia. Second worst, North Carolina. Only one team in the conference gave up more sacks than North Carolina, and that was Virginia. And that was a team that started off their losing ways last year, right before they dropped an L to Georgia Tech. Curious, isn't it? But we do lose Jakiah Leftwich to them. I think there was one or two more we lost to the portal. Paul Chio, he was a kid that transferred from Clemson and then decided to do what Pumachan did, go from Clemson to Georgia Tech to UMass. Again, I'm not crapping on these kids. I don't think they're massive losses. They're transferring due to playing time. And as we're going to talk about, we bring in some really good kids in this class. Also, Edenuza Rubin on the defensive line. I know we're not talking about them. He did the same thing, Clemson to Georgia Tech to UMass. That's the third player that's done exactly that trajectory. And there might be one more here. Elias Cloy goes to Alabama A&M. Again, I don't feel like a huge loss. Tyler Gibson he doesn't follow his brother. He goes to Charlotte, but he is Zach Gibson's brother, who will play, week 2 against Georgia State. And Wing Green goes to somewhere that I've never heard of, Campbell. The Campbell Camels. I know that because I'm pretty sure North Carolina plays them this year or they play them last year. Point being, we don't lose a ton. We are better this year on the offensive line than we were last year. We only lose one key player. We bring in another really good one. Let's look at backup contributors. First, let's talk about the young kids. We signed 3 really good offensive linemen in the 2024 class. Starts with Jamison Riggs out of Hiram, not far from where I am in Smyrna, maybe a 30-minute drive. 4-star freshman, a kid that both Clemson and Auburn were going out after, that Georgia Tech was able to get his commitment. And I think that speaks to just how good Georgia Tech is doing at developing offensive linemen. I think that's showing. Jamison Riggs actually was playing that right guard position while Keelan Rutledge has been out with injury due to that car wreck. He's a kid that I think could play tackle or guard. You could move him anywhere you need as injury dictates or as, just getting fresh legs in there dictates. Kai Greer, another guy that's a 4-star on some boards. Think you'll see him come in. He's more of a tackle, but he needs to put some weight on. I think he's listed at 280, 6'6". Probably need to get him more up to probably put another 30 pounds on him. Maybe at 310 would be a good spot. There's not a kid on our offensive line starting rotation, by the way, that's under 300 pounds. Anyone remember the first? Was it the Cincinnati Bengals that had the first offensive line? What was it back in the 80s? Maybe that everyone was 300 plus. Where we've come from since then. The other kid, Jordan Floyd, I think we beat out Auburn for him too, though I could be wrong. Another kid big, I think he's 6'5", 6'6". Another guy that, like Riggs, I think you could put at guard, you could put at tackle as the situation dictates. I think you'll see playing time out of all three of them. Now, do remember with the rules of college football today, you can play in 4 games and still retain your red shirt. So I do think all three of these kids will play in at least 4 games. Jamison Riggs, it'll be interesting to see how they manage that. I think he's a guy that the talent dictates he should be on the field a good bit, but you might want to save his red shirt where he'll have 4 years of eligibility starting next year. Brandon Best, he'll be playing backup at center. Another really talented kid. He'll come in as a redshirt sophomore. His competition for that backup spot transferred out. I think you'll see him get a good number of snaps as well. And left tackle Corey Robinson II, you'll probably see him get the most playing time in this group. He was a kid that started at left tackle last year, struggled a little bit early on. You know, we all remember the big sack against Haynes King at Louisville, led to a turnover. Probably, you can't even say probably lost us the game when you give up that many points defensively, but it was a contributing factor. Think he will be much improved this season. Was much improved moving forward last season. Is a good player, but a really good guy to have in our rotation. So let's talk about predictions for next year or for this coming up year. Who would I look out for? I think Keelan Rutledge is going to be a great piece coming in out of the portal. Weston Franklin, Ethan McKinney, Joe Fusel. I mean, it's hard to narrow it down just to one, though I don't see any scenario where we're not better on the offensive line this year, just barring a ton of injuries. We proved last year we could weather, at least one injury and keep moving. And we could do it again this year. I don't see a scenario where we're worse, barring just 2 or 3 major season-ending injuries on our offensive line. And I don't know a team in the country that could weather 2 or 3 season-ending injuries on their offensive line. That'd be 80% of your starting rotation. So let's back these out. So I predicted us a B- last year. I think we ended up being an A-. I think we're an A this year. Like I said, I don't see a scenario where we're worse on the offensive line this year than we were last year. I'll put us a half letter grade up. As high as people are on Miami and as high as people are on Florida State and Clemson, we don't have the quote unquote star power, recruiting wise on this offensive line that maybe those schools do. This could very well end up being the best offensive line in the ACC, and you can laugh now, but I've showed you the stats from last year to back that up. We only lost one guy off that offensive line. And I do believe this could be one of the best offensive lines in the country. There's a lot of people on Georgia Tech's offensive line that if you're hunting, let's go look back at our starters. Starting lineup. If you need a blindside tackle, I'd throw a bunch of money if I'm not Georgia Tech at Ethan McKinney. He's a great one. If you need a really solid left guard, a talented left guard, and you needed one for a season, Joe Fusel would be the guy. There's not a guy on our starting lineup that isn't. I almost used a Collins. I almost said playing at a high level. I've got to get that out of my vocabulary. Really good, though. So let me know what you guys think. We're going to have an interesting matchup week 1 to see just how good this offensive line is. I do believe Florida State has a very talented defensive line. We'll do a whole preview for that game probably the Monday before. Um, but you probably couldn't convince a Florida State fan of this. I would give that a push, if not the edge to Georgia Tech and the offensive who has a better offensive line there, though. Let me know what you think in the comments if you're a Tech fan. If you're not, do you think I'm crazy? Do you disagree? Let me know all that in the comments, and we'll be keeping these position previews coming out. Y'all have a good one.